Before the sun had fully crept over the horizon that fateful morning, I stepped out with a hot cup of coffee and was met with a sight that made my heart skip a beat. There, in my once pristine backyard garden, lay a mess of flattened, trampled tomato plants and scattered, bruised fruits. I'd spent months nurturing those tomatoes, carefully choosing the best seeds, tending to them day after day, and watching in pride as they began to ripen into a deep, luscious red. But now, something was terribly off. The vibrant tomato vines had been disturbed, and the smell of crushed fruit filled the air. I immediately suspected foul play. Rumors had been swirling for weeks about someone sneaking into gardens after dark. I had set up a couple of security cameras for my prized vegetables, and when I reviewed the footage that morning, my jaw dropped. There she was, HOA Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, stealthily creeping through my garden with a determined look, her gloved hands plucking my ripe tomatoes one by one. It was as if she believed that my bountiful crop was an affront to the uniform order of our community. My blood boiled, not just for the theft of my hard work, but for the sheer audacity of it. Karen had made it her mission to report every minor infraction, but stealing my tomatoes was a new low. I decided that if she was going to tamper with my garden, I'd give her a taste of her own medicine. With a spark of mischief and righteous anger, I hatched a plan. I would replace my tender tomato plants with a crop that packed a fiery punch. Carolina Reapers, the world's hottest chili peppers, would be my secret weapon. I spent the rest of that morning gathering my gardening tools and prepping my beds. The idea was simple. Plant these lethal peppers in the very spots where my tomatoes once thrived, and then catch Karen red-handed when she returned to pilfer. The thought of her, clipboard in hand, being forced to tiptoe through a garden transformed into a fiery trap was both thrilling and satisfying. Today, she wouldn't get away with it. Today, my garden would fight back. My home, nestled in the quaint suburb of Meadowbrook Estates, was the kind of place where neighbors took immense pride in their gardens, and every yard was a patchwork of carefully curated blooms and vegetables. The community itself was governed by a strict homeowners association, HOA, whose rules were enforced with an iron fist. Every blade of grass, every flower bed, and every vegetable patch had to adhere to a uniform standard of perfection. In such a place, individuality was often stifled under layers of bureaucracy, and that's where HOA Karen thrived. Karen Miller, known to everyone simply as HOA Karen, was a force of nature in Meadowbrook Estates. In her early 50s, Karen carried an air of authority. With her impeccably styled hair, tailored outfits, and a perpetually clenched clipboard, she roamed the neighborhood like a self-appointed guardian of order. She was relentless. If a hedge was slightly overgrown or a flower bed wasn't symmetrical, she was quick to file a complaint with the HOA board. Over time, her reputation as a strict enforcer grew, and many residents learned to tread carefully around her. Yet, behind her stern exterior lay a penchant for meddling that crossed the line between civic duty and personal vendetta. On the other side of this neat, regulated world was my little sanctuary, a modest house with a sprawling backyard where I poured my heart into growing what I loved most: my garden. I wasn't one to subscribe blindly to the HOA's vision of uniformity. I believed that a garden was an expression of individuality, a living, breathing work of art. I had cultivated a tomato patch that was the envy of the block, a riot of reds and greens that spoke of long summer days, hard work, and a passion for nature. Every tomato was nurtured with care, every vine tended lovingly, and every harvest was a reward for my dedication. Meadowbrook Estates, with its manicured lawns and pristine facades, provided a stark contrast between conformity and creativity. While most residents dutifully followed the rules, I had always allowed my garden to be a canvas for personal expression. It wasn't always perfect, but it was honest and full of life. This very authenticity, however, set me at odds with HOA Karen, who saw any deviation from her idea of perfection as a threat. So when I discovered that my prized tomato patch had been systematically plundered by someone in the dead of night, I wasn't shocked to learn that HOA Karen was behind it. But I was furious. Not only had she taken something that was the fruit of my labor, but she had also violated the sanctity of my personal space. It was a petty, calculated act of interference that had pushed me to the edge. I knew then that the only way to reclaim my garden was to fight fire with fire, quite literally. I decided to replace the stolen tomatoes with Carolina Reapers, peppers so potent that even a single bite could set your mouth ablaze. My plan wasn't just about retribution. It was a stand for individuality and a declaration that my garden and my freedom to grow as I wished would not be dictated by anyone, not even the most self-righteous enforcer of rules. The discovery of the theft set my mind racing. I spent the early hours reviewing my security footage and tallying up the losses. Every frame confirmed what I had suspected. HOA Karen had been sneaking into my garden repeatedly, methodically removing my tomatoes. I could see her gloved hand deftly plucking the ripe fruit, her eyes scanning the area for any witnesses. It was as if she believed that by removing these vibrant, homegrown tomatoes, she could force me to conform to the bland, colorless standards of the HOA. Determined to fight back, I began planning my retaliation. I scoured gardening blogs, consulted with local horticulturists, and even visited a specialty nursery to procure Carolina Reaper seedlings. These peppers were known as the hottest in the world, fiery, unpredictable, and not for the faint of heart. I was convinced that if Karen returned to steal from my garden again, she wouldn't find the sweet, juicy tomatoes she was after. She would instead be met with an explosive burst of heat that would leave her reeling. Over the next few days, I prepared my garden for the switch. I carefully cleared out the remnants of my once thriving tomato patch and prepped the soil for new life. Every shovel of earth and every drop of water was an act of defiance, a way to reclaim my space and send a message to those who would meddle in my affairs. I planted the Carolina Reaper seedlings in the exact spots where my tomatoes had once grown, arranging them meticulously to mimic the layout of my previous crop. I watered them gently, knowing that these tiny seedlings held the promise of fiery vengeance. I also took extra precautions. I adjusted my security cameras to focus on the new plantings, ensuring that any further intrusion would be documented. I even left a discreet sign in the garden, a tongue-in-cheek message reading, "Welcome to the Pepper Patch. Enter at your own risk." It was a subtle, humorous warning, but one that I hoped would deter any further attempts by Karen to tamper with my property. As I worked, I couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. Here I was, a proud gardener who had spent months nurturing a vibrant tomato patch, only to have it systematically plundered by the very person who claimed to enforce community order. It wasn't just theft, it was an attack on my right to express myself, to let my creativity flourish in a way that the HOA simply couldn't understand. I posted a brief update on my community forum, explaining that I had taken steps to protect my garden. The reaction was instantaneous. Neighbors who had long endured the HOA's rigid standards flooded the forum with supportive messages. Finally, someone standing up to HOA Karen, one user wrote, while another declared, "Your garden is your canvas. Don't let them take that away from you." The solidarity was heartening, and it confirmed that my struggle was not just personal, but shared by many who chafed under the oppressive rules of Meadowbrook Estates. Days passed, and the Carolina Reapers began to take root. Their dark green leaves and determined, compact growth promised a harvest that would be as potent as it was punishing. I eagerly anticipated the moment of retribution, knowing that once the peppers matured, any attempt by Karen to sneak into my garden would be met with the fiery wrath of nature itself. Then, one warm afternoon, as I tended to my new pepper patch, I caught a glimpse of movement on the security monitor, a figure approaching my garden. My heart pounded as I zoomed in on the footage. There, unmistakably, was Karen. Her eyes were fixed on the newly planted reapers, her gloved hand reaching out as if drawn by an irresistible urge. I held my breath and watched as she leaned in, her expression one of greedy anticipation, unaware of the danger that lay before her. I knew this was my moment. I decided to let the digital evidence capture every second of her intrusion. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would expose her for the meddler she was, and more importantly, prove once and for all that my garden, and my right to cultivate it was not up for grabs. The tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch as news of my retaliatory planting spread. Social media erupted with posts and hashtags like hashtag #PepperPatchRevenge, hashtag No More Tomato Theft, and hashtag HO Exposed. Neighbors who had long been at the mercy of the HOA's arbitrary rules found themselves rallying behind me. Videos of the freshly planted Carolina Reapers, vivid green leaves juxtaposed against the dark, compact fruit, were shared widely, each one a silent declaration of defiance against conformity. Local news outlets, always hungry for a story that pitted individual ingenuity against institutional overreach, quickly picked up the saga. Reporters drove by my property, interviewing curious neighbors and capturing the subtle tension that had built up over the weeks. "It's amazing to see someone take a stand like this," one reporter commented on air, turning a simple act of theft into a full-scale protest against arbitrary HOA rules. The narrative was evolving rapidly. What began as a petty dispute over tomatoes was now a symbol of the broader struggle for personal freedom and property rights. Within the HOA board, divisions deepened. Board members who had once supported Karen's strict enforcement now found themselves on the defensive, facing a growing chorus of dissent from the community. Emergency meetings were convened, and digital copies of my security footage and watermark images of the Carolina Reapers were leaked online. It became clear that Karen's actions were not isolated incidents of overzealous rule enforcement. They were part of a systemic pattern that had long suppressed the individual spirit of our community. At town hall meetings and community forums, residents voiced their frustrations. "I've always believed that a garden is a place for expression, not conformity," one neighbor declared at a particularly charged meeting. Others recounted similar experiences, being fined for having an unapproved garden design or being harassed by the HOA for small, personal touches that made their homes unique. The collective outcry was impossible to ignore, and soon, a digital petition demanding reform of the HOA's policies amassed thousands of signatures. Karen Baxter, now increasingly isolated and desperate to salvage her authority, began to double down. She sent out a series of stern emails to the board, decrying what she called vandalism and outrageous disregard for community standards. Her language was harsh, accusing me of inciting chaos and undermining the fabric of our community. But the digital evidence, the security footage of her sneaking into my garden, the countless photos of the vibrant, fiery Carolina Reapers, and the impassioned testimonials of supportive neighbors spoke louder than her words. Late one afternoon, I received a notification on my phone. My security camera had captured Karen in the act of trying to remove one of the pepper plants. Her gloved hand reached out, almost mechanically, to pluck the Reaper from its bed. I zoomed in and watched as her face, usually set in a mask of rigid authority, twisted into a look of pure avarice. I recorded the entire incident, knowing that this footage would be the final nail in the coffin of her credibility. The neighborhood was now buzzing with anticipation. Every shared video clip, every hashtag, every comment on social media reinforced the growing movement against arbitrary HOA enforcement. The narrative had shifted completely. This was no longer just about stolen tomatoes. It was about reclaiming our right to cultivate our own spaces, to express ourselves, and to stand up to overbearing authority. As I continued to document the unfolding drama, local authorities began to take notice. The county inspector, prompted by several complaints and supported by digital evidence, initiated an investigation into the HOA's practices. Rumors circulated that the inspector's office might even consider sanctions against the board for allowing such overreach. This official scrutiny only amplified the community's call for reform. By the end of the week, the digital petition had crossed the tens of thousands, and a final public hearing was scheduled by the HOA board to address the controversy once and for all. The tension was palpable as residents prepared to gather in the community center, determined to see justice done and to restore the freedom to cultivate their own gardens without fear of punitive measures. Every conversation on the street, every shared post online underscored the message. Our community would no longer tolerate petty abuse of power. The fight for our rights was no longer just my battle. It was a movement that united every homeowner in our neighborhood. And as the final public hearing drew near, the stage was set for a showdown that would redefine the future of our community. The decisive moment came on a crisp morning at the Colonial Heights Community Center, where the final public hearing was underway. The boardroom was filled with HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and a diverse array of residents, each one determined to witness the final reckoning. With a calm, yet commanding presence, Councilwoman Evelyn Martinez stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the collective hope of a community that had grown tired of arbitrary enforcement. After an exhaustive review of all digital evidence, including security footage, eyewitness accounts, and the overwhelming public support documented online, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Martinez began, her voice steady and resolute. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Baxter, namely, the deliberate dumping of soap in a neighbor's pool and the subsequent interference in property rights, were not only baseless but stemmed from personal bias and a gross misuse of authority. Note, although our case involves stolen firewood replaced with ant-filled logs, this line can be adapted appropriately for our tomato scenario. Here, we replace dumping soap with stealing tomatoes and sabotaging a garden. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Today, we stand not only to rescind the fines imposed for these actions, but also to institute sweeping reforms that ensure every resident's right to cultivate their own property is inviolable. Our community must be a place where creativity and personal expression are celebrated, not stifled by petty rule enforcement. Her declaration resonated powerfully, and murmurs of approval rippled through the room. At that moment, a well-respected community advocate, known for his tireless work defending property rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united in defense of our freedoms," he proclaimed, his voice firm and impassioned. "No one should have to endure the tyranny of arbitrary rules imposed by individuals who think they can dictate our lives. Let this final vote be the turning point, a clear declaration that our community will no longer tolerate abuse of power. We demand accountability, and we demand respect for our right to cultivate our own spaces." His words were met with thunderous applause, uniting the room in a shared resolve. Following this, a senior officer from the local police department presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, including security footage of Karen Baxter's covert trips into the garden and multiple eyewitness testimonies attesting to the theft of my tomatoes. The evidence was irrefutable. Karen had repeatedly stolen from my garden, and my plan to replace my tomatoes with Carolina Reapers had successfully caught her red-handed. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures against her, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release to ensure transparency. Councilwoman Martinez concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Colonial Heights, a community where individual rights are sacred, where property owners are respected, and where no one can abuse their power without consequence." Our vote today is not just about reversing a fine. It is about affirming our collective commitment to freedom and creativity in our community. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for justice. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom reflected shock, determination, and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community had forced a decisive action that would forever reshape the governance of Colonial Heights. The days of petty, arbitrary enforcement were over, and a future built on respect, accountability, and personal freedom was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the historic decision, Colonial Heights underwent a transformation that resonated far beyond the confines of individual gardens. News of the rescinded fines and the sweeping reforms implemented by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and across social networks, igniting passionate debates about property rights, creativity, and the responsible use of community power. Editorials in the local paper, bearing headlines such as "A New Dawn for Colonial Heights" and "Community Unites for Creative Freedom," celebrated the decisive actions that protected individual rights. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreHOA and #GardenFreedom trended widely, reinforcing the community's determination to stand up against arbitrary rule enforcement. Town hall meetings and community forums were held with record attendance, as residents gathered to share their experiences and envision a future where personal expression was not punished. Neighbors who had long lived under the oppressive rules of the HOA now spoke openly about their right to cultivate their own spaces in whatever way they saw fit. "Our gardens are our sanctuaries," one impassioned speaker declared, his voice echoing through a packed meeting. "We must protect our ability to express ourselves through our property, without fear of retribution." The atmosphere was charged with hope, a collective promise to build a more inclusive and flexible community. Within the newly reformed HOA board and the local police department, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, introduced comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint would be rigorously scrutinized and that no resident would ever again be subject to arbitrary fines or intrusive inspections. "Our duty is to protect the rights of every homeowner," Lieutenant Reed stated in a follow-up press conference, reinforcing the renewed commitment to fairness and justice. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations mobilized as well, organizing workshops and public forums designed to educate residents about their rights and to empower them to stand up against overreach. When we unite as a community, our voices become a force for change, a local activist proclaimed at a crowded town hall meeting, inspiring neighbors to embrace their individuality and protect their creative freedoms. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and transformative. My decision to stand up against HOA Karen's theft of my tomatoes and my subsequent retaliation by planting fiery Carolina Reapers had not only reclaimed my garden, but it sparked a movement. Neighbors, once too intimidated by the rigid rules, began sharing their own stories of how they'd been stifled by the HOA's arbitrary standards. The digital evidence that had captured Karen's misdeeds became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and creative freedom. Karen Baxter, once the formidable enforcer of HOA edicts, found herself increasingly isolated. Records of her past transgressions, previous complaints for the smallest deviations, were laid bare for all to see. Her influence waned, and she quickly became a cautionary tale of what happens when unchecked authority meets a united community. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Colonial Heights, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the warm glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Garden Pride" was unfurled between majestic oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed promises of a brighter future. Today, we celebrate our right to nurture our creativity and protect our property without fear, Councilwoman Martinez proclaimed, her voice ringing with determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation that our community had reclaimed its freedom and that arbitrary rule enforcement would be a thing of the past. As each new day dawned over Colonial Heights, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of progress. The story of how HOA Karen Baxter's theft of my tomatoes was met with fiery retribution, and how the truth about property rights and creative freedom prevailed, became a rallying cry for every resident. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Colonial Heights, the spirit of individuality and the right to self-expression would forever be cherished. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more committed to a future where every homeowner's rights are protected and every act of creativity is celebrated. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Colonial Heights would forever be a place where freedom, integrity, and the power of creative expression shine brightly.